Hi, I'm Shezad Dawood, and I'm here to talk to you tonight about certain aspects of my practice under the banner of Metissage, the Contrapuntal and Heterotopia. I wanted to first start by deconstructing those three key themes that I wish to explore and where they originate. Each of them comes from a key thinker that has had a real bearing and importance for my thinking and my practice. So let's start with Metissage. I use or borrow the term from Françoise Vergès, from her book, which looks at creolization as a mode of refuting power or the normative within the island nation of Réunion. The second book that I refer to is Freud and the Non-European by Edward Said, which derives from a lecture that he wasn't actually allowed to give at the Freud Museum in Vienna, so had to take place at the Freud Museum in London. And the contrapuntal that he uses in that is a musical term to talk about two divergent scales. And he manages to move between a very interesting exploration of, I guess, the essence of inclusion-exclusion that is at the heart of a sort of monotheistic debate. I could go on, I could expand on that for hours, but I just almost wanted to set each of these three examples as a sort of precursor to my talk. And for any of you who want to, you can ask me further questions at the end, or go out and read those books if you haven't already, and think about how they might speak contrapuntally to my practice. The third is a key essay by Michel Foucault of Heterotopias and Other Spaces. Again, it's the text of a lecture, and each of these texts were recommended to me at different points in my journey, in my career, my studies. And I wanted to really start by saying how sharing and exchange is so vital, I think, to each and every one of us. But for me, it's something I always like to foreground as vital to my practice and thinking. Françoise Vergès, I was introduced to by Francette Pacto, one of my supervisors on my MPhil at the Royal College in London. I was made to go back and reread Freud and the Non-European by Suhail Malik, one of my external supervisors for my MPhil. And Michel Foucault, and that particular essay was a gift of Anne Talentire and Monica Ross, who ran my very experimental, progressive undergrad program, Critical Fine Art Practice at Central St. Martin's, where we spent a lot of our time sitting around debating the relative merits of Hélène Cixous and Luce Irigaray, and it was a very, very formative time for me. And this is 1994 to 1997. I was on that undergrad program in London, so it was really, really ahead of its time in not just engaging with, but negotiating and arguing about a lot of these key thinkers around gender, race, indigeneity, before this started to become more of a generally accepted rubric in art schools. So I was very privileged in a lot of my education to encounter not just the thinkers behind the key texts, but the thinkers who shared them with me. And moving on from that, I guess, to think about Metissage, I love this idea of being both within and without. For me, it's a way of both wielding power and resisting it. And it's, I guess, how I've enjoyed a kind of trickster position in my politics and my practice. Obviously, my reference to trickster is Jean Fisher, who was also a great, great influence on me. And I was lucky enough to have her write rework a key lecture of hers for an essay for my exhibition Piercing Brightness at Modern Art Oxford in 2012, which I will return to as a methodology. I wanted to begin by thinking about this idea of being outside in, or being alien, because I always think of something or somebody as being alien actually is not a definitive other. I think the alien is always and forever that insider that disrupts our sense of self. And for me, that's important, and it's always been important to me that as much as I've had my own issues with racism and othering, I also try to sort of move back to this point of a universal otherness that I think even normative society is terribly frightened of, even though it's more true in terms of our more existential being. So where do I go with this? I wanted to begin by talking practically about an exhibition I curated for the Devi Art Foundation in Delhi in 2013 called Black Sun. And, the Black Sun, actually the title had derived from an earlier work of mine. It's a neon work called The Black Sun from 2010 and features an ultra daylight neon on a painted black rectangle. So you have this differential between foreground and rearground, where the ultra daylight actually burns a corona onto your retina and is made all the more powerful in contrapuntal terms by the matte black rectangle behind it. So one thing shoots backwards and the other element shoots forward and literally imposes itself onto your retinal. And therefore everything you see after seeing this work is through this corona, which, I won't make a joke about its current relevance. But the Black Sun, this idea of transition, transformation, which for me is both an esoteric category and a social process. And for me, it's how do we resolve the material, the immaterial, how do we work through this sort of maze of opposites? And for me, it was how to move from my thinking around that work into a whole exhibition that I curated from it. And it's very much how I work. It's this sort of ebb and flow from something that's very distilled, like the neon work, that's very distilled, almost deceptively simple, but can become a portal to a whole, exhibition that was meticulously considered and researched over a period of years, preceding the neon and beyond its manifestation, in Delhi. And for the exhibition, there was a number of artists, James Lee Byers, Tejal Shah. I was very interested in this idea of making a show in India that I was asked by the Devi Foundation to deal with the theme of diaspora, but I didn't, I found that quite limiting. So the subtitle of the show, Black Sun, was Alchemy, Diaspora and Heterotopia, which felt like a much more honest but also playful set of preconditions to work within. And, James Lee Byers and his use of materia magica, to Tejal Shah, who's a friend, and I managed to persuade her to work with a very early piece of work called Unfurling, which shows a series of portraits of a trans woman. And for me, the opening image of the series has the subject posed in front of a reflector with a black rim, which for me was an icon of the Black Sun. In fact, considering the show, that image was on my pinboard, and therefore, it was almost essential to have it in the show. I remember Tejal asking if I wouldn't show something newer of hers that she felt was more nuanced around the subject, but that had been such a key opener for me. And I think, that's a really important term, opener, and I don't use it lightly. An opener is something for me that opens a different way of seeing. And it's crucial to artists, writers, curators, exhibition makers. I think anyone and all of us that require a process of creative transformation to generate anything useful for an audience. And I'm going to go on to think about openers in the map of the exhibition Black Sun. I'm going to specifically talk about two more artists and works that were in the show. The first is Matty Braun and his installation RT-STVS, which envisions, it's this beautiful installation that envisions a key scene from a script by Satyajit Ray. So Satyajit Ray wrote a film script that that it's widely talked about was the basis for Spielberg's E.T. Spielberg was a huge Ray fan, and this never-filmed script about a very endearing alien who appears, out of the blue in rural Bengal is a beautiful paradigm that I think a lot of artists have addressed. I've been fascinated by it. Matti actually externalized it as an installation, which is kind of like a set for the opening scene, this kind of swamp with tree stumps into which the alien steps. And then actually the same fugitive figure of the alien seems to, move through the Otolith group's film Otolith 3. And this idea of how an alien would view us and a way to kind of examine our own history from another pair of eyes, for me is an active and empowered use of othering or reclaiming othering as a migrant subject. We are fleeting, but in a way we remind the host body that it too is fleeting. I wanted to move on from a consideration of this exhibition, Black Sun, to think about other key moments of fleeting interactions. So a lot of my work is about collaboration. It's about sympathy, solidarity, moving through times and spaces. So perhaps a useful point to jump to is my film Towards the Possible Film, which is from 2014 and is set in and around Sidi Ifni in southern Morocco, near the disputed territory with the Western Sahara. We'll show a short clip of that now. Now, Towards the Possible film was a key project of mine. It drew on a lot of vectors and, how they come together and started to speak, almost in a series of different languages. One of the key tropes was a collection of objects I stumbled into in the British Museum, assembled in the 18th century by a group of aristocrats. These sacred objects from India, North Africa, and ancient Mexico were used by this group of aristocrats to propose a sort of Bermuda Triangle of world religion or belief systems that originated between those 3 points, all through a common factor of a blue-skinned returning god. So, Osiris, after he's dismembered and dispersed by his brother Set, is reconfigured by his wife Isis and becomes the blue green-skinned god of the afterlife. Quetzalcoatl, the winged serpent of the Aztecs, in human form is blue-skinned. And of course, in India, you have Krishna, bitten by a snake as a baby, draws the sin of the world into his pigmentation and turns blue. And I wanted to think about this idea of the sort of once and future king that predates the figure of the returning Christ by millennia, and to really think about where belief originates, ends. And so Towards the Possible film, I have these blue-skinned astronauts who actually emerge from the sea rather than from the sky. And obviously I was interested in flipping this axis of sea and sky to think about the sea as the great uncharted territory. It's only in recent years that we've started to make as much progress in understanding the furthest reaches of the oceans as we have to outer space. And I also wanted to play with time past, time future, because I think, how do we know? How do we come to know? And in that way, I guess I've always been interested in this, a fault line between anthropology and science fiction, where one is predicated on the past, one is predicated on the future, but they're both about trying to kind of understand being better. They're both actually very philosophical disciplines. I'm going to go on to talk about piercing brightness, which I mentioned earlier. I'm going to start by showing a short clip of this film.
We know nothing as a fact. It's a belief. The idea that we will be cast aside when we return is a theory spouted from that stage.
I like to show a clip often before I talk in more detail because I think it's important for the condensed, visceral, visual collage of the work to speak before I do. Otherwise, in some ways, I can remove its agency. Piercing Brightness was a very interesting project that I was invited to do by a public art commissioning body in the northwest of England called In Certain Places. And they were interested in me making something in the city of Preston, which had been a formerly very wealthy centre of the textile trade. So in the Industrial Revolution, Preston became very wealthy based on patterns. Handmade patterns, or a handmade pattern book that was assembled in India and brought back to Preston to be mechanized by the fledgling factories there and then sold back to India and the rest of the British Empire. So Preston for me became a very interesting space to interrogate, also because in its more contemporary incarnation, it has various communities. It has one of the fastest growing Chinese communities in Britain, and there's been all sorts of issues around labour there, and famously cockle pickers who lost their lives. And this whole idea of a transforming globalization is also repeated in small towns and cities the world over. But Preston became a very particular one for me because of this textile history that my own family were involved in. So my own father and his cousins came to the north of England in the 70s as part of what was called the rag trade and worked in textiles between India, Pakistan and the north of England. And so I had a very particular connection in that sense by line of descent. And I became interested to think about these various histories and who owns them and who tells them. And I started to, again, use this agency of an alien viewpoint to really think about ideas of citizenship, belonging, and who gets to set the rules. So I worked over a period of a couple of years with various communities in the city to think about how they would see themselves, and we created a science fiction feature film which spoke of a glorious 100 alien beings who were sent by an advanced civilization to the Earth millennia ago, and who had all somehow ended up not in Tokyo, New York, Mumbai, but in Preston. And over millennia had slowly, through a kind of amnesia or Alzheimer's, lost memories of their origins as they became more earthbound. And I wanted to talk about this idea of belonging and return, return to some sort of also a fantasy of a point of origin, because many migrants and refugees I've spoken to, particularly those who either left their place of origin, decades previously, or are second or third generation immigrants, actually their vision or imaginary of their place of origin is no longer current or relevant to how that place of origin sees or constructs itself. And, what happens to us in this process of estrangement? Who do we then choose to become, and where do we seek new points of identification, or can we exist without identification? And this became a very interesting way to sort of consider various forms. So generally around my films, I will make other works, paintings. I work with textile a lot, obviously, because textile has such a rich history for me. It's interesting that, in some ways, going off to art school, I was seen as somewhat of a disappointment, and now my studio is flooded with textiles and looks not too dissimilar from my grandfather's, textile shop on Marine Drive in Mumbai, many decades ago. But somehow the use of vintage or contemporary textiles and recutting them, reassembling them, is also a way to work with time. And also, like the neon I opened with, it's a way to work with foreground and rearground, which for me become a way of working through time. So often with these painted textile works, I am cutting and reassembling the textile fragments, building a grid which already speaks to sort of foreground, rearground, and an idea of time past and time present, before I then start to work over the top with paint or print. And I love these very sort of material technologies And I see them very much in the way I see editing techniques. It's a way of composing in space. And I guess now I want to think about, I'm actually going to return to Morocco and play you a little clip of the new Dream Machine project. For those who don't know, the Dream Machine was originally conceived in the 60s by the beat artist, writer Brian Gysin, who often collaborated with William Burroughs, was the lover of the Moroccan painter Mohamed Hamri, and spent a lot of time in North Africa. Interestingly, at a time when the beat generation, fleeing the repressive regime in the States, escaped to North Africa. Interestingly, at the same time, like ships in the night, a lot of the Moroccan intelligentsia and avant-garde were fleeing the repressive regime of Hassan II, often because of their Marxist or other affiliations. So it's interesting that you have these flights going on without maybe one fully cognizant of the other. And interestingly, a lot of those discussions are being corrected as important Moroccan journals like Soufre from the period are getting the attention they deserve. But the Dream Machine is meant to be a sculpture, a kinetic work that you see with your eyes shut, as the central cylinder rotates around a light source. The cutout patterns in it generate flicker on the back of your eyelids, which generates a kind of trance state in which you can see colours and forms oscillating through closed eyelids. I wanted to revisit this and very much its mystical Sufi origins and take it back to Morocco. So I worked on making an industrial-sized Dream Machine, as you saw in the film. The original is actually about that tall and actually worked on a vintage turntable. Mine works on a large, industrial belt drive. And I was interested to see if the effect could actually affect a much larger audience over a much greater distance. Gysin's original, you had to be sort of this close to it. And I was also interested in a parallel history about the Rolling Stones in Morocco. So the Rolling Stones had been in Morocco, hung out with Gysin and Hamri, and Brian Jones, the ill-fated member of the Stones, had apparently got so wasted, he woke up one morning and the rest of the Stones had left him in Tangier, and slightly estranged and bedraggled, he sought out Gysin and Hamri, who took him under their wing, but took him to Jajuka in the Atlas Mountains to meet the master musicians of Jajuka, with whom he apparently played an impromptu jam session that we only hear about, almost as a kind of mythic meeting. Brian Jones did return to Jajuka. He was so enamored and produced an album called Brian Jones Presents the Pipes of Pan at Jajuka. He did that subsequently, which in some sort of silos is regarded as one of the sort of pioneering albums of what would later come to be called world music. I'm pretty wary of the term world music, or horrified by it, to be honest, because it's I've always felt it was exclusionary from its first coining. generally you'd go to a record shop and still do, and you have music which occupies 70 to 90% of the record store, and the remainder is devoted to world music and, go figure. But I was interested to sort of make this return and got in touch with the master musicians of Jejuka, who in their current incarnation, led by Bashir Attar, have actually been going for generations. It's actually a pre-Islamic form, as the Brian Jones album denotes, the Pipes of Pan. Their music is a kind of a ritual of spring. So it's pagan in its origins, and Berber in its origins. So it is pre-Islamic, and this idea in ancient Berber culture about the cult of the cave or the grotto was very important to me in sort of thinking about, even Plato's metaphor of the cave and light in the darkness, and that transformative power of a sort of epiphanic consciousness that can only come through, affect, a visceral affect, rather than, writing about it. And so I invited, contemporary cult British guitarist Duke Garwood to come and perform with the master musicians at the Cinematheque in Tanger. And again, talking about solidarity, it was my friend Ito Barada who very kindly invited me and Abdellah Karoum, the curator of Apartment 22 in Rabat in Morocco, to come and stage it at the Cinematheque. And I love that kind of frisson where projects come out organically. For all the intention, they also come out of conversation, they come out of solidarities, conversations, exchanges. And this, the Dream Machine project is always, it's an appropriation from its first incarnation. I want to now go on to talk about some of my more recent work. I have been working for about more than a decade on modernist architecture in South Asia. This began with a project called Cities of the Future at Gallery Kimul, Prescott Road in Mumbai in 2010. And my first case study, as I call it now, I didn't know at the time it was going to be one of many, was looking at Corbusier's work in Chandigarh in India. And, I'd been very frustrated while studying when I'd talked about the esoteric in relation to Corbusier and the influence of India on Corbusier. When I was a student, there was a lot of pushback from, very Eurocentric teachers and professors who said, oh no, there's, who maintained a very, cold, rational basis to Corbusier and a very, Eurocentric modernist, Eurocentric basis for the modernist project, which obviously, we all know now is not the case. But with that project, I really wanted to take an idea for a walk, which was to look at the influence of Tantra on Corbusier. I mean, I found in Corbusier's diary about, he actually saw Chandigarh as the, a possible apotheosis of his whole career, and the influence of India on his thinking was very, very important to him. And I wanted to take that one further and look at how tantric form had somehow crept into the designs for this master planned city to herald, a newly independent India. The second case study I'd like to talk about is Antonin and Noemi Raymond's project for the Aurobindo Ashram dormitory in Pondicherry. A much less, famous and vaunted project than Corbusier's in Chandigarh, but actually very important nonetheless. And for me, one of my personal favorites. It's quite an interesting backstory. Raymond was actually working as Frank Lloyd Wright's assistant on the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo when they had a major falling out because Raymond called into question Wright's lack of engagement with Japanese culture and history in his designs. And actually many years later, I found a photostat of the letter Wright penned to Raymond, pretty much telling him he'll never work again. And actually the only job the Raymonds could get was this very, low budget job for the Aurobindo Ashram, where Actually, half of their construction crew were the ashram devotees. It was bamboo ladders. And yet, it seemed to result in one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen. It's known as Golconde. And Raymond, I see that he brought something from Japan to bear on it in terms of an interesting use of negative and positive space, but that also has a certain, frisson in an Indian context. But this building, is rightfully, celebrated amongst architects. Raymond is very much an architect's architect. But there is no fan or air conditioning system. It is just these louvered shutters that are transverse across the building. And the spaces inside are just absolutely beautiful, as you can see from the images. And I suppose with each of these case studies, I've taken plans, sections of the architecture for a walk through paintings, neon works that I suppose, like the Black Sun work I began with, try and distill something of the essence of what is going on in this cultural exchange, intersection, that isn't, for me, about just an imposition of European Western modernism in South Asia. I think there's something far more interesting, nuanced, and at the very least two-way going on. My third case study, and possibly the most personal one of them all, is about Richard Neutra's proposed US embassy building in Karachi. So many people probably know about the CIA bankrolling abstract expressionism to provide a totally homegrown US modern art movement. Interestingly, in parallel, the US State Department also launched in 1951 the Embassy Building Program, which was about sending US modernist architects to new Third World allies as buffers against Soviet communism. So again, showing for a very brief period in the 50s and early 60s, a vision of America as dynamic, open, welcoming, and moving into the future, which ended very abruptly with both the Vietnam War, but also protests outside the US Embassy in Argentina in the early 60s, which resulted in a whole new set of parameters for US embassies, what generally has led to the fortress embassy that has only extended its fortress-like barricades ever since, for various reasons. Interestingly, in a way, Neutra's proposed embassy was for Karachi in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis moved their capital from Karachi to the new city of Islamabad halfway through the construction phase, and therefore the embassy got downgraded to a consulate in what seems like a key and pivotal misunderstanding, which becomes an analogy for US-Pakistan relations ever since. And I'd conceived of a project which was co-commissioned by the Sharjah Biennial and New Art Exchange in Nottingham, which premiered in Sharjah in 2019, called Encroachments. And I wanted to use the embassy or consulate as a centerpiece for a project extending in time both before and after, and looking at other ideas of territorial, integrity, sovereignty. So I start with Feroz Sun's bookshop, which till it closed its doors, the branch on Mall Road in Lahore was the oldest and longest running Urdu language publishing house and bookstore in the world. And I'm very interested in spaces, and maybe this is a good opportunity to take a pause and just show you a little trailer for the VR virtual reality work I showed in Sharjah. as you can see, the opening scene is a recreation of Thoreau's Son's bookstore, pretty faithful, even down to the various different generational layers of the floor itself. So the floor, in this way for me that spaces activate memory, the floor had been filled in, I guess to save costs, at various points when there'd been floods, fires, and therefore the floor, it contained multiple floors, about 10 or 15 different floors by my reckoning, that, when you'd step in would be this visceral marker of time, history, memory. It became, the floor itself was like an archive. So that's where you start. Equally on the bookshelves, I worked with book covers. I populated the bookshelves with my 120 favorite book covers, so Urdu book cover graphic design, that were ever made during the 20th century. So that becomes a sort of archive as well. The bookshop would never have had that exact selection of books repeated around its shelves. But that's something you can do in virtual reality to almost make you more aware of not just the construct of virtual reality, but the very construct that virtual reality is signifying. And that's an important distinction to bear in mind. I like to think that it's all, a level of signification that we're moving through. The world, I question its reality. And I think that's an important one when you start to think about the categories of otherness and the categories of, normativeness that mainstream society clings to, which is obviously in defiance to the very nature of change. You, at the back of the bookstore, a secret passageway opens up and you find yourself in a video game arcade in the 1980s. I used to play in these video game arcades as a kid. I didn't realize at the time, but video game arcades were a very important US government propaganda export in the 80s, rather like the use of science fiction films in the 1950s, such as Invasion of the Body Snatchers as covert anti-Soviet propaganda. Video games like Defender and Space Invader were equally speaking to a new generation of third world US allies and their children about territorial integrity and safeguarding not just your bodies but your minds from any sort of Marxist or socialist leanings, which in a way is very important, because if we think about the lost opportunities of the post-colonial period, the non-aligned movement, etc., it was very much a failure to really instill a fair socialist series of governments in a lot of post-colonial developing nations that would have been far more representative and fairer than the autocrats and dictators that were subsequently installed one after the other. Going back to the paradigm of the embassy consulate, this was a key one for me because like the video game arcades in the 80s, I used to go to the American Center, the sort of propaganda family wing of the US consulate in Karachi, where you could access American comic books like Richie Rich or Archie, and Hostess Twinkies, which seemed like a rare delicacy to a young boy in Karachi, in those days. And again, very uncritically, I was a kid, but later I could come to look at how propaganda is sort of instrumentalized through popular culture as a form of cultural encroachment. So I think you have all sorts of, psychic kind of battles going on simultaneously at the sort of level of territory, but also at the level of culture. My memories actually of the consulate were very kind of happy ones. But it was later when I sort of returned to it and started to kind of go into it in more detail, and I was helped by the architectural historian Barbara Lamprecht, who also introduced me to Dion Neutra, Richard Neutra's son, who also worked with him at the end of his life in his practice. And an interesting story I wanted to share with you kept coming back. It was one that I'd heard earlier. There was a rumor, even when I was a kid, that the consulate had been built, was haunted. It had been built on the site of a Sufi shrine devoted to a great Sufi saint. And in fact, there is, from my research, I found even a a British Raj era ghost story about a Parsi family who built on over the shrine, and the whole family were cursed and died, in ever more ignominious circumstances. Later, the Pakistani architect R.F. Balgormi, he mentioned a Pakistani author who also wrote a ghost story set in the consulate where, the consular workers were sort of frightened and shocked by photocopiers going on and off at odd times of the day and things going bump down corridors. And interestingly, in speaking to Dion, he told me that his father had told him that there was a shrine and he had actually built around it out of respect. And, when it took me years to gain access to the consulate building. Similarly to Faro's Sons, it had been sold off by the US State Department a number of years ago to private developers who were then engaged in a battle against the sort of architectural and cultural community in Pakistan and Karachi to try and preserve the building because of its architectural significance. And so obviously, because of this fraught court battle to try and preserve it, it was very hard to get access. But when I finally did, I was taken around by the old wizened caretaker who had a longer, whiter beard than mine and had been there for decades. And, I'd been there to film and to photograph, to help, build the embassy, the consulate in VR, but also to reproject some of the interiors in VR, or to make experimental film using Super 8, Super 16 to reproject within VR. So I'm often very interested in the digital and the analog and how they can, combine rather than being necessarily opposed. But to get back to the ghost story, we were finally leaving the building and I thought, God, if I don't ask, I'll kick myself forever. And I said to the caretaker, is there any truth to this story about a shrine? And he said, come with me. And he led me round the corner, and it was just to the side of the entrance pathway I would have taken, every day as a kid going to the American Center to read comic books. There was a walled-off area in which and he opened a sort of low door that I had to crouch down to go into, and just inside was the Sufi shrine, which was wonderful. I remember sharing the photo with Arif, with Dion, with Barbara, the sort of revelation that, all the stories were true. It's also, I guess, as much as the sort of the politics and the social frameworks of my work, there's a sort of joy in this shared inquiry that for me allows me to sort of readdress histories and bring them to light into the present, because, this, for me, the whole project on modernist architecture in South Asia, how it connects to the Cold War, the non-aligned movement, it's for me to sort of explore pathways or utopian, heterotopian possibilities that we didn't go down, but that could still be useful as new methodologies we might invent for today. One of the key elements in the films that are projected within the VR is the elderly caretaker going through an endless series of doors down a corridor that wasn't listed on any maps, and that actually housed the CIA supercomputer during the Soviet-Afghan conflict. And obviously, the aftermath of that is something we're still very much living in today. This idea of buildings and the mysteries, the histories they sort of still contain or have within their body, I think we sort of do ourselves a disservice when we think of buildings as material objects outside of ourselves. And just to end on, one of the key things for me is the floor also of both the embassy and the video game arcades I played in. These were always a sort of terrazzo flooring, locally known as chips. And in the 50s, we Pakistanis tried to develop terrazzo flooring for export, but it just wasn't good enough. So it became first used in the 50s for the consulate, for more important buildings, and by the 80s, it was just done cheaply in disused commercial spaces that became ad hoc video game arcades and could easily have a bunch of machines shunted in, a cash register, and a portrait of Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan. And so this, as much as the consulate becomes emblematic of of a sort of failed politics between US and Pakistan. So the floor also becomes this sort of memory of a sort of unfulfilled potential for me on a personal level, because it was what I would look down at every time I ran out of change and died playing Space Invaders. I would look at this floor in in sadness and in dejection and a kind of humiliation as we all competed for the high score. So this is why this sort of terrazzo, I reinvented it and I took it from the floor and made it the walls of a lot of these exhibitions related to encroachments. A project that has since toured to the New Art Exchange in Nottingham, and I hope will go further still. I'm currently working on the final case study, but before I get onto that, I might show a little film of the University of Non-Dualism. This film is a rehearsal for a project I staged at Frieze Live as part of their programme of performances at Frieze Art Fair in London last October, which was a co-commission from them and Dhaka Art Summit, and to look at the Bangladeshi architect Muzarul Islam, who is a really, really interesting figure. And it was very important for me that in the arc of the projects I eventually worked with, actual South Asian architects. Islam was a student of Louis Kahn's and actually was invited to do the National Assembly building in Dhaka, but invited Louis Kahn and became his assistant on it. But Islam is a very interesting figure, activist, writer, polymath, educator. And why I used the title University of Non-Dualism for this project is that for me, Islam seemed to channel, almost early Vedic Advaita philosophy of non-binary thinking in the way he wrote about how the modern shouldn't be opposed to the vernacular, and neither should the rural be opposed to the urban. And in that way, he falls into the category of, I think, what is sometimes a bit, crassly termed tropical modernism, where a sort of essential modernism that comes from non-Western centres actually integrates better within those contexts by integrating the artisanal into the fabric of building, but also integrating the outside in. So the garden is often very central to Islam, and in that way also there's a nod to Tagore. In fact, Muslim Islam often cites Tagore and Marx as key influences on his thinking and praxis. And that was something I really wanted to explore, how we could think through a sort of continuum of inside and outside and a non-binary thinking that almost is very essential to our current moment. How do we think through an architecture that can support a different kind of vision of the human body and a non-binary, amorphous, more open non-definition of where one body ends and another begins. And I think I will just hint that my final and last case study that I'm just starting to research is around Minette de Silva, the great Sri Lankan architect, who's often overlooked in favour of Geoffrey Bower, but actually I would very happily live in one of her buildings any day. And the sort of final chapter of my work on Islam and the very beginnings of my research on Minette de Silva will be exhibited at Veals in Brussels later this year. So I hope, even if you can't travel there, you might be able to see the exhibition online and put that final or near final piece of the puzzle together. I do intend to go on developing a body of work around Minette de Silva, more in depth. And otherwise, I didn't want to get totally lost in that because it's a whole other massive universe to get into. But my other project that I've been working on for some years now is called Leviathan, which you can read more about at leviathan-cycle.com. And it's a huge epoch-spanning project looking at the intersections between climate, specifically in relation to the oceans, the refugee crisis and the whole notion of migrancy, and finally the mental health aspect of how these things affect and will continue to affect us unless we really take stock and own a degree of intersectionality which we are so overdue to properly start to encompass as a species, and how that intersectionality needs to go beyond the human as a point of urgency to both the flora and fauna which we exist in symbiosis with. I might just end on a little trailer for one of the Leviathan films. Thank you very much.
We were being obliterated through a complex time delay mechanism. As if we were a mirror for something much bigger and more pressing than ourselves.
Loudness, monster.
It always made me smile. All these men and women in their lab coats and their immaculate pens, biros, pushed into the front pockets of their lab coats. I loved coming in here, permitted, if only briefly, to gaze on such wondrous and dire possibility of this magnificent descendant of the Orthicon, Leviathan. And in that moment it seemed to take me in. as the short-term experiment we like to call society was ending, each prophecy of the end of the world was coming to pass. We have a lot to learn from the true master race. Or perhaps we are learning. Leviathan.